This video we are going to talk about the concept of promises. Now, last video we have seen how does asynchronous task work in JavaScript, and we saw how it went into an callback hell. So this video, like we do in our real life, when we have to do something which will be in near future, and we want to commit to something, we make use of the term called as promise. We make certain promises like I'll quit smoking, I'll go to a gym, I'll do this, I'll do that. But that is in a future or a near future, and that can either that promise will be kept or it will be broken. So based upon how that promise is kept or broken, we take the further decisions. So same way in JavaScript, whenever you want to do an asynchronous task, there is an object called as promise which will allow you to handle this sort of asynchronous jobs very easily and in an efficient way. So let's jump into it and start understanding. So as discussed, a promise in JavaScript can result in either resolve or reject. That when the promise is fulfilled, we go to the resolve, and it is rejected, it is rejected. So as we have seen in the last example, here we had a callback function, you remember, right? And we went into a callback hell. So this time, what I'm going to do first, let us understand the concept of promise individually and then use it into the same example. So I will say async 1, async 2, promise concept. Okay, dot js file. So this is my concept which I want to understand. How we do that? Let's say const p is equal to new promise. So I have got an object called as promise. In this promise, there are two functions. Yeah, there are the inputs are two functions. See, this is where we write the asynchronous task. Okay, but where do I call when the promise is rejected and kept or broken? So they are given two inputs. First is what function to be invoked when promise is kept. Okay, first thing. And then they give two functions. Function to be invoked when promise is broken. When promise is broken. Now let us try to do some any task, not even an asynchronous task, any task. So here let's say console log, I'll say task to be performed. Okay. Then I say let's say my const task is successful. It's a number. Okay. And you remember from the truthy falsy value, if a value have a number, that will be considered to be true. So I'll say if my task is successful. So I will do what? I will invoke the function when promise is kept. Okay, when promise is kept, and basically I can pass. I can say that I can pass any variable here. So any number, and I say task is successful number. And when I go to else is what? When the number is zero. So this time, what I have to do is when the promise is broken, and I can simply say number is zero, or I can throw an error, something like that I can do from here. Now, so this is an object of promise. Yeah, this is an object of promise. After you have returned the promise, you know promise is asynchronous. Okay, promise is of nature asynchronous. Now what happens here? There are two functions inside promise. First is called as then function. Okay, so if I say p dot then, it internally takes a function here. What is this function? This is nothing but when, yeah, when your task is successful, right? This is the callback function which is invoked, it lands up here. So whatever is there passed as a parameter here will be received here. So I can say value returned when promise is kept. Okay, and you can do whatever you want there. And then at the same time, because this is a chained function, I can also have dot catch. Catch is where when the promise is broken. Yeah, catch is where when your promise is broken, it will be invoked here. So value returned when promise is broken. Okay, for now I will just print it here. So let's say uh, console log promise is kept, and console log what is the value returned when promise is kept. At the same time here, console log promise is broken, and console log value returned when promise is broken. So there are two iterations here, and we can check them out both now. So how about I just start a terminal. Switch to point, and here what I do is I will say node space. Okay, my file node space async to see task to be performed. The promise is kept, and I was not able to pass the number. Why is that so? Task is this number should have been okay. This has to go as a single value. I messed up here. Okay, now it will show the number. So promise is kept and number is 10. But at the same time, if I make it 0, that means this is not going to be, see, the promise is broken and the number is 0. So this way what happens when you have a promise and you keep that promise, see, it will be here. Then I will be having another promise here, and this value is what I get returned. I will be able to keep it very simply. Now, so I hope this clears the concept of promise. And now let's jump into another part where we do the same example where I had a user callback function when ID is returned, repos for the user. You remember the case study, right? We get the data from the user database. Then I got the GitHub user ID. I make the call to the GitHub account and I get the repositories. So those things we have to do it here. But before we jump ahead, I want to show you something. See, when you write the promise, you cannot be writing the promise this long, right? It does not make sense. For understanding purpose, this is fine, but not when you are working like this. So like in a real project. So what you do when you create a promise, rather than saying function to be invoked when promise is kept, the standard value is to give it the function name as resolve. And when the promise is broken, we call it as reject. So instead, we call here what? We call the resolve function of this promise, and we call the reject function of this promise. Okay. And normally here, what we do, value is returned. So I say, like this is my value. Normally, I will call this as value. I will call this as value. You know what? I will also keep this commented so that if you want to check out or you want to follow along on this one, you will be able to do it properly. I will go ahead and comment this off. And now when I say value is being returned, I will just say value instead of other things. And this time also I'll say value. And here I will say, because it's an error, I'll say it's an error value. Okay. Here also I will say it's an error value. Okay. This way, see, this time it is again 0 because my task successful value was 0. And if I make it something else now, let's say I make it 20, run it again. So task to be performed, promise is kept, and the number is 20. So this is the easier way of getting into the promise. Now let's jump into our actual case study and try to work on that. So what we will do here is let's create one more file and call it as async3 promise solution for our actual case study. So actual case study was what? We had a get user function which had a callback function, and then we had a get repos for get user. So I'm going to copy these two functions now into my actual solution function one, and here I have got function 2. Okay, so what we are going to do here now is let's take this callback function off. We don't need that anymore, and then create a new promise object. Okay, I'll say const p is equal to new promise. Okay, and in my promise, I will have my resolve and reject. So this is a basic format, right? Like whenever you want to write, you say resolve and reject. Now I will move all my asynchronous tasks which I was doing inside the body of my promise. Okay, this has become my body of my promise. And here what I do, I say resolve. So it will call the resolve function. Yeah, this particular function, like whenever this is done and we have got the git user, it will return me the resolve after this 300 seconds. And if you see, we have got this promise, and then from here I say return p. So I return my promise from here. Same thing I am going to do here again. First thing, step one, get rid of the callback. Then create a new promise object. So I'll say const p is equal to new promise, and then this promise will have what, resolve and reject, and inside that I will move my asynchronous task, and instead of callback I will now call my resolve function. Yeah, I will call my resolve function, and the last step, we have to return this promise from this particular function. So I have structured my function accordingly so that it will be able to get my scenario back. Now if you see, this is returning what, a promise, this is also returning what, a promise, and now I have to make those calls. Like how did I do in the first one? I made the call get user, then inside the get user callback I was calling the second one. This time it will be bit easier. I'll say console log before, then I say const promise is equal to get user. Now get user, and let's say I pass 1001 as my ID. Now because this is a promise, it will be having what? It will be either resolve or it will be rejected. So I'll say promise dot resolve. Okay, promise dot then. Yeah, we have seen that there is a then function. So I say promise dot then, and inside this then function, what it is exactly returning to me? It is returning the git user, right? So I will be able to get my git user here because it is coming as a incoming parameter. So I say git user, and that's fine. Then let's do what? I'll say console log, and here in this console log I will simply just print the git user. Let's check this till this step, and then I also have dot catch. Now this dot catch will do what? It will give me any error if we have console log of error. So now let's try to execute this. We will say node space async 3 promise solution. So it goes for before, then it says wait for that time. So here it is waiting for 3 seconds, getting the data. Whatever is result is resolved, I will get it here. I got the value. Now you see, I want the repos from the git user, but this git user is actually doing what? It is also, it requires the git user as an input. So obviously I'll have to make the call from here because I have access to this git user inside this function. Plus I have to again attach that promise ahead. So I have to do what? I will say, see, const repos promise. This is my repos promise, right? Is equal to get repos for git user, and I pass my git user there. So this time what will happen? It will return me a promise. What I do? From this internal function, I return this repos promise. What will happen then? Then this then is actually returning a promise. Okay. So I can attach one more dot then, because see, this internal block of then is itself returning a promise. So obviously after this then I will be getting a promise back. That promise I can call the then function, which will return me the repos now. Yeah, this should be returning me the repositories. So I say whatever are the repos I got. So here I can simply say console log repos for user are, and I can just attach those repos. So it will give me a good idea about the repository. So what is happening? First I call the then, which I take the git user. It based upon this git user, it returns me the value. I get that value. That value is required in the second one. So here I return that promise. I call the other function which returns me the promise, and I return. So this internal function here is returning me the promise. that promise I am calling to the like I get the promise, I call the then function. This way what happens now is console log, sorry, I say node space async 3. So first, after 3 seconds, it returns me the user ID. And after another 5 seconds, it will return me, see, repo 1, repo 2, repo 2. Yeah, it is returning me those data and it is getting me the values back. Okay. So see, it's not very much like, if you see the callbacks, this is a much better approach where I am chaining the promises, like one promise returning another, and then I'm handling it there. Now, one more situation I want to show you what will happen if the promise get rejected. So in this situation, in both the situation, I will only have one catch. Why? Let's say if something goes wrong here, instead of instead of resolve, I call reject. See. Yeah, instead of resolve, I call reject. And okay, let's not do it this way. I say reject. I'll keep this resolve as it is so that we know the exact difference. So I'll say reject, and inside reject, I pass a new error object saying some issues while fetching username from DB. Okay. And now let's see what happens. Where does it block? So same catch. Okay. This needs to be commented. Okay. So it says some issues while fetching the username from DB. Okay. Now let's say the first promise resolved properly and the issue was with the second promise. So here let's say I comment this, and this time I use the same reject but with a different message. Some issues while fetching repos from GitHub server. Okay. Now let's say what happens this time. So I got the first value, but while the second one was getting executed, it is giving me an error. So we don't need multiple catches. A single catch is enough, because any of the promise, if it gives you a rejection, that whole chain will be broken. So this is how you implement a promise instead of a callback. Callback is very, you can see callback is very tricky. You have to write a lot of functions. In promise, you just keep on chaining them. Yeah. You just create a chain, and based on that chain, it becomes easier for them to understand. Now, the ultimate solution to this is using async await, which will make it way easier, which will be our next video. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will add this code on my git repo. You can check it out from there. Please do like, subscribe, share. If you like this concepts of promises, please share it with your friends. Thank you.